All right. Hopefully I remembered everybody there. All right, so Lucas, sorry this week I did not get anything out because it was a very busy week as far as work weeks go, so I wasn't able to get out any questions, because this week is kind of a little bit weird. I do have some questions that I'm going to be asking, but we're not actually just going through Job. Like we talked about last week, we finished up Elihu's speech, and we talked about how God, how he's using a storm to discuss the power of God. And of course, we talked about a lot more than that, but that's kind of where we ended with talking about how God then comes out of the whirlwind to speak to them. But before we got into that discussion to go through what God says, I wanted to stop and take some time to discuss the topic of God's providence, or the providence of God. And where we ended, I think, was I had just asked, what does God's providence mean? What does the word providence mean? So we'll pick up. Somebody doesn't want to talk about the providence of God, I guess. That was quite the sound there. All right, so anyway, so what is providence? What do we mean when we talk about the providence of God? There it goes again. Yep. But at this point, he seems to scream louder every time I say Providence. I'll try that again. It's like one of those movies, you know, like in Indiana Jones when he's like hammering the nail and the guy's like, and he hits the thing and the guy's like, or no, he was stamping. He was stamping the book or whatever. Yeah, that's what it was. He was stamping the book. Yeah. All right, so anyway, back to Providence. What does the term providence mean? Or what are we talking about when we talk about God's providence?
I remember last week, but I slept too many days.
All right, well, what we talked about is that, I think somebody, and I didn't have it written down, but somebody actually looked it up, and I think Jimmy maybe Googled it or whatever, and it basically gives the same definition as what Wayne Jackson gave in his book. It says the term providence is derived, of course, the dictionary didn't say this part of it, but the term providence is derived from the Latin providentia, signifying foresight, and this is what basically the definition then. The word is used to denote the biblical idea of the wisdom and power which God continually exercises in the preservation and government of the world for the ends which he purposes to accomplish. So it's basically how does God working in the world, is the way I translate it. So with that being said, where we ended, I think, and where we're going to pick up is, how do you think God works in the world today? Take a second to think about that. You don't actually have to say what you think, but just kind of formulate what your view of how God works in the world today is. I don't know if you thought about that very much, but we read in the Bible what happens, right? And we see how he was working in Old Testament and then in the New Testament, and we see those kind of things. How does he work in the world today? And then along with that, a question is, does he actually make specific things happen? And where I'm going with that question is, there's a few different views of the way God works or doesn't work in the world. So like on the extreme side, I think we may have mentioned this, I don't remember if I actually got to this point or not, but there's people that are called deists. And a deist believes that there's a creator, but the creator hasn't ever had anything to do with the world that was created. So basically, sort of set it in motion, and left it to its own devices at that point. Never intervened or had anything to do with it. So basically, world was set up and then left alone. And actually, as part of that, I guess the extreme view here would actually be of an atheist, somebody who doesn't believe the world was created by a supreme or a superior being. Because as an atheist, you believe it just happened. Now then, we've talked about that in detail for a few weeks whenever we had the discussion about have atheists prove there is no God. We'll also hit that a little bit more when we talk through some of the things that God says in his speech. So atheists might be what you might call the extreme view, that there is no creator. But as far as creationists go, deists would be the extreme view. And I think actually a deist would probably be harder to convince to follow God because they already believe there's a creator. They just don't believe that the creator gave us the Bible or that the creator cares. Whereas an atheist, if you can convince them that there actually is a creator, you probably have a better chance of teaching them about the Bible, I would say. So anyway, that's one view. On the other side, there are people who think God controls everything. So they see God working in everything. So if you find, and I remember now, this is where we ended last time. If you find a good parking space, God helped you do it, right? If you bump into someone and they become a good friend or a husband or a wife or something like that, God caused that to happen. If you have a bad baseball game, like what I used, whenever I had a bad baseball game, it'd be, like, God, why'd you do that? So you're blaming God or giving credit to God for everything that happens. God determined what is going to happen. So that view almost takes away a lot of supernatural, it actually almost views everything as if it's supernatural, as if it's a miracle happening. God intervenes in everything. Or in a way, it almost limits free choice, I think. Like, if God's causing all this to happen at every stage of the game, every stage of your life, does that mean he's directing certain people to bad and certain people to good? Or things like that. So I think that's also an extreme view. So, as kind of as an example of that, do you think God picks out each spot that a natural disaster is going to occur? Or does he determine if each accident is going to happen? No? Okay, so what do you think?
Well, God didn't make any promises that he wouldn't suffer.
Right. So how does the world operate, or how does God operate in the world? And I think based on our discussion that we've had, and on my here again, it's my opinion. As I said, nobody knows the answers to a lot of this stuff for sure. But I don't think God operates that way, where he's picking, where he's saying, this earthquake is going to happen in this spot at this time to do this certain thing, or the hurricane's going to happen and for this reason. I think the biblical view is that God created the world with certain laws. We might know them as the laws of nature or things like that. And that much of what happens is due to those laws that he's established. However, God didn't just create the world and then leave it like what a deist says, like just leave it to itself. We know that he's performed miracles in the past, as we see in the scriptures, and so we know that he didn't just leave it to its own devices. However, there are differences of opinion today as to how much God interferes or intervenes in that natural law today. So I think kind of what we talked about before, with when people say, God led me to do this, or God was working with this. What do those things mean? What does that mean to us? And I think it's, to each person, it may mean something different, like how you're looking at it or what you're thinking. So going back to the definition of providence, Wayne Jackson says that providence concerns God's support, care, and supervision of all creation from the moment of first creation to all the future into eternity. So basically, as long as the world's here, how does God work in the world? And it's opposed to deism, and it's the opposite of fate or chance, which would see the world's events as uncontrollable and without any element of benevolent purpose. And he said that he thinks that God exercises a general providence over the universe as a whole and special providence on his children, his people in particular. So that's kind of an introduction to it, and I don't want to spend like weeks on it. I just want to spend today talking a little bit about it and what it means to us, because I think it's important that we have an understanding, or at least a good grasp, not necessarily that's completely accurate of how God works in the world, because like I said, none of us can claim to know that, right? But that we at least have a proper view and not on those extremes, because we just talked about a couple weeks ago how our view of God, actually last week I guess it was, no, 2 weeks ago, how our view of God, how that causes us, what changes it might have in the way we live or in the way we see the world and in how we view things. So I think it's important that we have that proper view. So in his book that I've been talking about, Wayne Jackson gives some important principles for understanding divine providence. And the first one is that God never providentially operates in any way that is in conflict with his nature or his revealed will. God's act of providence must be consistent with his traits. So that makes sense, right? God wouldn't ever cause anything out of the ordinary to happen that contradicts his divine traits. What are those traits?
He's loving.
God's love. Forgiveness. What's that? Hope. What is it that Jimmy always talks about a lot? What's the two things?
Justice and righteousness.
Justice and righteousness. So he's never going to do anything in a miraculous way that contradicts those aspects. If he did, what would that mean? Would mean we couldn't trust him, right?
Well, now bear with me for just a moment as I throw a little fly in the ointment.
You're not going to do that again, are you, Charles?
It's my nature. So, the book of Habakkuk, he cries out to God because of the injustices in Israel. And God's reply is, I'm going to do something you wouldn't even believe. I'm going to send the Chaldeans. And Habakkuk's reply is, but they're worse than the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And God goes, I know that they want to, and I want them to do it, and I'm going to help them and protect them. But don't worry, I'll later get around to judging them for doing what I want them to do. So, where's the justice?
Where's the justice? We're going to hit nations in just a little bit as well on that. So you're jumping ahead on that front. But does God, I'll just ask a question in response to that. Does God, do we see in the Old Testament that God uses nations to punish Israel?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So where is the justice in that? Because the nations aren't better than Israel, right? That's the point you're getting at with what was said in Habakkuk. These nations they're worse than we are, right? That's kind of the point.
I think there's a real need for us to be able to recognize that we are only looking at it from a limited perspective, right? If we acknowledge that God is outside of time, outside of space, outside of all of that, right? That everything exists separate, or he exists separate to all of that. That when we view life, past, present, and future from our perspective, it is distorted to a manner that is, again, limited to understanding the full picture, right? So if you were to say, hey, this river is flowing in this manner, and you would say, I would understand it to continue to flow in this manner in the future, God may say, well, it's not going to be that way. It is going to change. I'm going to put a rock there. I'm going to do whatever. And then it changes the flow, right? And so from the standpoint of us to look back in of the past and be able to say, well, where's the justice there? Again, it is from a limited perspective of what is the true story, right? And so we have to acknowledge that God is beyond our own understanding and be able to say, hey, if we know these to be true, right, these characteristics, that he's going to have justice, then we have to have the faith of and understanding that he is going to work certain things out, and in the end, he works out all things to good for those who love him, right? So acknowledging that he's beyond time, beyond all those things, allows us to be able to say, okay, we may not understand why this is happening right now, but big picture, you're going to work it out to it's justified.
Or for his purposes, right? Like God knows more, and that I don't know if that's the answer to your question, Charles, but yeah,
Do things happen?
right. It's
My question
is I think your question was, is it right for God to raise up this country to?
Does God use injustice? Because your statement was you wouldn't do anything like that. And my reply is, but I see plenty of examples where he does use injustice.
Well, I would not say that. I don't think you ever see God using injustice, and I think you see things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to have happen.
When he sends a lying spirit, I'm sorry, God sent a spirit who says, I'll go down and lie to them. And God says, do it.
So is it injustice for God to allow these things to happen?
For God to say, go do this. That's different than, I want to go lie, and God says, all right, I'm just going to let you do it, as opposed to, I want you to go do this. The difference between the Chaldeans wanting to be evil and go conquering, and God going, I'm going to protect them in their evil. I'm going to raise them up and nurture them so that they'll be evil, and then I'm going to turn them loose. Like with Pharaoh. Could God have simply struck Pharaoh one time, smacked him upside the head really hard, and let his people go? And God, no, not so fast. I want to do more.
Right. Well, we're going to talk about Pharaoh in just a couple of minutes as well. But I don't know. I didn't study some of the examples you just gave, so I'm not prepared to give an answer as to whether it is as you are portraying it, with that being an injustice.
I'm just asking. I'm not saying it is. I'm asking.
No, but I don't think that God would use an injustice in his purposes. So I think whenever you look at it, those specific places, we'd have to dive into each one to look at what was happening and really what was going on with it, would be my thought as far as that goes. But does God do things that we don't think would be right and to fulfill where things are supposed to go? I think, yeah, there'd definitely be times where, as Lucas was saying, yeah, we don't see the big picture, we don't know what's going on. And so to us, it looks like this is horrible. What's going on here? But in reality, that's not. In fact, that's what Job's all about, right? Job, like, what's this injustice that's happening to Job? And yet, there's much more going on behind the scenes than what we know. But yeah, I'm not prepared to go down the road of going into each of those instances and seeing what was happening on that. I don't think that God would ever do anything that would actually be unjust to further his cause. That would be counterproductive, I would say, in my opinion. So I think that we need to look at it from that viewpoint. The one that you mentioned, I remember the passage, though I don't remember the exact story with the spirit that was going to fill them, the prophets, with the wrong thing. There again, that's leading people, to me, that's leading people down where they want to go anyway, already. But I'd have to look at it specifically to see exactly what all was going on there on that. So anyway, that's not a full answer, but that's kind of where I would go on that road. The second thing that he says is that divine providence does not negate our free will. And that goes back, and we're going to hit that here in just a moment, to Pharaoh, because there's some scriptures that almost make it sound like that's not the case, right? But as we discussed in detail when we talked about why there's evil and suffering in our world, many of the negative consequences we receive are the result of our own free will or someone else's free will. Sometimes we're an innocent bystander, but we receive, we get the consequences from that other person's free will. So that's as an example, this is probably a bad example because it's kind of lighthearted compared. This is a very serious topic here, but on a lighthearted, if you have any, I know most of you in here probably don't watch NASCAR, but last week there was a race, and there was an incident where one person wrecked another driver, and one of the playoff drivers got taken out in the wreck. He had nothing to do with it, but as a result of it, of the one person's decision to wreck the other person, he got caught up in it. That happens to us in life, right? As a result of one person's decision to do something wrong, we get caught up on it. And much more serious, somebody who gets murdered. They didn't choose to be murdered. They didn't do anything wrong. Well, I shouldn't say they didn't do anything wrong. They may have been doing something wrong. They may not have. But I mean, we're hearing about that a lot in our society, right? The person who is killed is not necessarily doing anything wrong. I mean, it depends on the situation. You don't know that, but so that person is suffering the consequences of another person's decision on what they do. But God's providence will not negate our free will. So someone may ask about Pharaoh. Let's go to Pharaoh. Let's talk about him. Exodus 4:21, and then there's a few verses here, 7:3 and 9:12. If you guys want to read those.
The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have in your power, put in your power. But I will harden his heart, so that he will not let the people go.
And then 7:3.
But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. If Pharaoh does not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my hosts, my people, sons of Israel.
Yeah, go ahead and read down through 6, actually, or 5. Go ahead and read through 5. That's good.
Well, we have Exodus 9 up here, so starting at 12 on the screen there. And the Lord had hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and say to him.
Something must have happened there because that's not what I'm reading.
Yeah, it's back on like 7. You're in 7, right?
7, yeah, 7:3 through 5, yeah. The first part that you read was right. Maybe the page flipped.
You said 7:3.
Yeah, just 7:3, yeah. So, you went on to 21. Okay, never mind. All right, yeah, so I'll read the rest of 3 then. When Pharaoh will not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. Okay, and then what you read there in 9:12, go ahead and read that again, DP. I messed you guys up, sorry. Like I said, I was running behind, so I only gave them these scriptures like right before we started.
And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses.
All right. So, like Charles said, could God have done this a different way? He could have, right? When it says that God hardened...
He decided to work through Moses and Aaron.
Right, he could have one and done, really. He could have done anything, just struck Pharaoh, or any number of ways. So, did Pharaoh have a choice in this, or is God causing him to do what he did?
Pharaoh always had a choice. God, when it says that God hardened his heart, God didn't harden his heart. Pharaoh did that. God simply picked the timing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, God, here again, like Lucas said earlier, God exists outside of time. He knows, this is what we're talking about with Providence, right? He knows what's going to happen. So God knew what Pharaoh was going to do. Like, it's not like it's kind of the other way, as opposed to God making him do it, God knew he was going to do it. That's kind of the difference in what happened here. But did Pharaoh have a choice in the way he responded to the plagues? Of course he did. He could have, at any point, he could have said, I see that God's the ruler and I'm going to do what he says, right? But he didn't do it. But God used that to do what? To show not only the Israelites that he was God, but the Egyptians and everybody around there that he was God, right? I mean, what happens whenever people hear that the Egyptian army has been swallowed up in the Red Sea? It's a pretty big event, right? So yeah, that I think we need to be aware whenever we're reading scriptures like that of what's happening there. Also, another question: what about Judas? Let's go to John 13, 25 through 27.
Through 27. He leaning back thus on Jesus' bosom, said to him, Lord, who is it? Jesus then answered, This is the one whom I shall dip the morsel and give to him. So when he has dipped the morsel, he took it and gave it to Judas, the son of Simeon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, What you do, do quickly.
All right, so what about Judas here? It says Satan entered into him. Did Judas have a choice in what he did?
Yes.
Go ahead, Charles, elaborate. Or do you not want to?
Choice.
It was his choice. So what does it mean when it says Satan entered into him?
Opinion. Satan no more entered into him at that point, that is to demon-possess him. Rather, he was willing to do what Satan wanted to do.
He had already made the choice, right?
Yes.
He had already gone, at this point, he had already gone and gotten the 30 pieces of silver and made the arrangements. So I think that's the way I interpret it, is he just continued on with what he had already decided to do at this point. So the simple answer, not easy, it's not an easy answer, but the simple answer is, yeah, they always had a choice. But God knew what choice they were going to make. I mean, Jesus knew from the beginning when he chose Judas what Judas was going to do. So he knew. All right, another principle in dealing with providence: the providential should be distinguished from the miraculous. So miraculous, miracles mean something that can't really happen normally, I guess you would say. What were miracles used for? Healing.
God's demonstration of
for demonstration of power. That's one of the things. And the other thing that I would say is to show that it came from God. So like when the apostles started, spreading the gospel, how was that shown to be from God? Like, I mean, you're taking and you're saying Judaism's no longer the way. This is the way now. So how do you prove that?
Raise people from the dead, heal the crippled.
Right, the miraculous powers that were given to the apostles. So that's miraculous. But God can also work through providential means, which is not miraculous. It means using his natural law in a way that furthers his purpose. So, like, of course, you just gave the example I was going to give, raising the dead. That was a pretty big sign that this is outside. Like, providentially, we can't come back from the dead. That's not something that can happen. That's a miracle. So that we need to make sure that we distinguish those two things. Another principle, God works behind the scenes through providence. While miracles are demonstrable events showing God's power working outside of the natural law, providence is more of God's guidance or use of things that naturally occur in the world. So we see examples of this in Scripture. For instance, when Joseph was sold into slavery, that wasn't a miracle, but he ended up where he needed to be. Now there was miracles involved in that to some degree, because how did he get there? Well, you know the story of Joseph. He ends up getting thrown into prison, and then how does he end up in the position he's in? Well, that's through some miracles, because he is able to interpret the dreams, which allow him to get in that position. So I'm not saying that there wasn't anything miraculous in the story, but Joseph being sold into slavery, that wasn't miraculous. Joseph being put in prison, that wasn't miraculous. Those things were leading to where he needed to be. And of course, that helped in fulfilling God's promise to Abraham. I just wanted to read a passage there, Genesis 45, verses 4 and 5. One of you guys wants to read that?
Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they came closer, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life."
All right, so Joseph is indicating that he knows that God sent him before to help with that situation. Just on another note, it would have been interesting to be Joseph's brothers there, right? Can you imagine, come a little closer, and then he starts laying it on you that who he is. I mean, that would have been quite the event for them, I'm sure. And we know that they were kind of frightened by the whole thing at that point. Yep. All right, so here another example. Esther was put into a position where she could help to save God's people. Let's read Esther 4:13 and 14.
Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this?"
All right, so like we just said, the story of Joseph actually does have some miracles involved in it. I'm not sure that I see anything in the story of Esther that involves a miracle. Charles is looking at me like I'm crazy. But God isn't even mentioned in the book of Esther. I don't even see the word like where they refer, other than what Mordecai indicates God through what he says there, right? If you've been put in such a place for this purpose. But he doesn't say God. So there's no mention of God in the book of Esther. But there's a lot of God's working in the book of Esther. You know, like, and a lot of irony too, with Haman. And when we read that with the kids, we talk about how ironic it is. You know, he's there, and the king asks him, you know, what should be done for the person who the king wants to honor? And then Haman's like, oh, I know, that's got to be me. Who else would he want to honor? So he gives him all this great stuff, and then he ends up having to lead Mordecai around to be honored because he thought it was him. And then he has the gallows built to hang Mordecai, and then what happens? He ends up being hung on those gallows. So we see a lot of working of God in Esther, even though there's not necessarily a miracle, you know, like a raising from the dead or something that happens. Now, you were looking at me like I was crazy. What?
No, when you said God's not even there, it's like, wait a minute.
No. Oh yeah. God's really involved in this whole thing, but he's never mentioned in the words in the story. All right. Okay, and then of course we can see providence in the life of Paul a lot as you roll through it. As an example of that, and this is just one that kind of talks about how God can even use a situation where we think it's a bad situation, but to the good. Let's go to 2 Timothy 4:11.
Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service.
All right, so Paul mentions to Timothy to bring Mark. Now, you remember what happens with Mark? What happened with Mark? Do you remember Paul and Barnabas? Right, he left them, and then it made Paul so angry that the next time that they're going on a trip, what happens? Barnabas wants him, and Paul's like, no, I don't want him along. He abandoned us last time. I don't want him. So what ends up happening there? They end up splitting up. Paul takes Silas, Barnabas takes Mark, and they end up doing more. And then we see here, and when he's writing to Timothy, what does he say about Mark? He's useful for me, right? So that's just an example of, you know, how does that work for God's good and service. All right, well, I thought we might get through the entire discussion here, but we didn't quite make it. So we'll pick up and finish. What's that? You didn't do too bad this time, Charles. We're good. I kind of figured that we might have a little more discussion than what I had on paper. So we'll pick up there next time. I'll leave you with a question just to think about, just what your response is and what your thoughts are. Can a person be used providentially by God and not know it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, you know, think about that. I think so. But think about how that can happen. And then we'll wrap this up next week. And then probably, maybe, it might take us that whole week to finish this up. But if not, we'll get started in on what God has to say after that. So, all right. Thanks for your comments.